Well met, everyone. I am Rich the Lich, and today is my first video in a new video series called LOREBORN. It's a real cool, crafty, clever way of saying lore is the background, the story of something, and born is birth. So the story, birth, the new version where a thing began. This is a knowledge drop type of thing. So what I'm talking about today is the Githyanki. Apparently, if I'm looking at Wikipedia and how you say their name, I've been saying it wrong forever, 25, 30 years. I've always called it Githyanki, but when you hear me say Githyanki, I'm talking about the same thing. That cool creature with the sword that looks like this skeletal thing, the cover of the Fiend Folio, that guy, that's what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not talking about the history and the fictional aspect of the Githyanki, where we talk about their dealings with the Mind Flayers and their cities and their society within the astral plane. I'm not talking about what it looked like at the gaming table. This is a story on the beginnings of the Githyanki from a out-of-game publication point of view. Where did they first come from? When did they first arrive on the scene? Where did they begin? And where are they now? So this is their journey. Let's jump into it. First, a bit of overview. Eddie Jones was an awesome sci-fi illustrator, and in 1979, he drew the cover of White Dwarf magazine, issue number 12. White Dwarf magazine is a magazine created by Games Workshop, probably most well known for the Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k franchises. Now, Games Workshop, the miniature wargaming company, had this magazine called White Dwarf, and within it there was always this column, this section of their magazine called the Fiend Factory. And the Fiend Factory was user submitted, usually readers and fans of the magazine, that would create all these cool monstrous creations and things like that, and fiends, and send them into this column. One of the submissions was by a gentleman by the name of Charles Stross. He was a British sci-fi author. And interestingly, he put his creation, the Githyanki, into this Fiend Factory in the April 1979 issue, White Dwarf number 12. 2 years prior, in 1977, George R.R. Martin, that guy, the Game of Thrones, created a novel. He wrote a novel called Dying of the Light. And within that novel was an alien race known as the Githyanki. Based on some of my detective work, it seems that that was the first time that that name even came about. Charles Stross is credited with creating the creature and the monster that we know within the D&D space, but he borrowed the name from Martin. So kind of cool and interesting. Now, White Dwarf number 12 wasn't the first issue where they had the Fiend Factory thing. They had done this in previous issues as well. I mean, we're talking about White Dwarf number 12, so there weren't a lot of issues to this point. 11 more, right? Maybe, assuming that they did 1 through 11. The creations that were in the Fiend Factory were voted upon, and the highest voted were intended to be brought into an actual published book, which would later become the Fiend Folio. Now, White Dwarf Games Workshop, they had the blessings, and they were authorized to do this by TSR. So this was going to be a culmination of their best creatures all in the Fiend Factory, put into this book called the Fiend Folio, and it was going to be a follow-up to first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual. As can often be the case, there was some business issues and some hiccups, and what ended up happening is White Dwarf didn't publish the Fiend Folio. It was actually a couple of years in development, and things were, a little bit off, where Fiend Folio ended up getting produced. We all know the book, many of us will. I had the book in my hands once. It's that nice, beautiful blue book with the cover of the Githyanki. And that was actually published in 1981 by TSR themselves. There's some interesting bits as far as miniatures and whatnot, but from how I understand it, Games Workshop had their own line of miniatures for their wargaming stuff, right? It was called Citadel Miniatures. But apparently what had happened is, even though the bulk of the content of the official Fiend Folio was taken from White Dwarf's Fiend Factory, apparently, maybe it was tied into their miniature line, TSR also had their own miniature company they were working with called Grenadier Models. And the way it came out was when those Fiend Factory monsters were brought into the Fiend Folio, they had to transfer ownership rights of that creature. So that's kind of where the Githyanki, though created by Charles Stross in 1979 and put into that White Dwarf magazine, the Githyanki kind of transferred over to TSR. And the Fiend Folio is significant because that is where I believe the creature became famous. I have great fond memories of my time holding that book. And just that iconic image, again, that blue cover, the monster on the front, that's, to me, what made the monster famous. In first edition D&D, there were some other books where the Githyanki made an appearance. In 1988, there was a D&D module called Tales from the Outer Planes. Kind of a cool, ominous title, very Twilight Zone-y. And for the time period, of course, 1988, we're still talking first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And within that module, the Githyanki made an appearance, and it would detail and talk about their layers. Now, moving into second edition D&D, the first appearance of the Githyanki was in, I think it's the Monstrous Compendium of Planes, this thing. And the Githyanki were in there, along with some Githyanki variants. See, I said Githyanki. There were some variants of them as well. The version of the Githyanki that was in that book, in that compendium, as well as their variants, was later ported over into the same edition of this official second edition monster manual. There were some accessories within second edition where the Githyanki made an appearance as well. One of them is another monstrous compendium, but I think this one is a Planescape monstrous compendium, and they were also in a book called A Guide to the Astral. I had to pause sort of my version of the video for this here. I found Tony Dieterlizzi's website. Tony is an amazing artist. I'm a huge fan of his style. I believe he did so much of the stuff during kind of second edition Planescape, that type of thing. And this is on his from June 2008, so we're looking at over a decade ago. I'm just going to read this stuff to you. It's amazing because he had a big influence on the art and aesthetic during this edition of the Githyanki. The nefarious, notorious Githyanki. For us older gamers, we first saw these astral killers on the cover to 1981's Fiend Folio, and fell in love with their rich backstory and bizarre appearance. They always reminded me of some alien race on Star Trek, like the Klingons. Anyways, I got the opportunity to render them, and their Githzerai cousins, quite a few times for Planescape, starting with the first Monstrous Compendium. In fact, I still remember one game reviewer saying that my Planescape art reminded him a bit of Dr. Seuss. I wonder if he was looking at my Grinch-like Githyanki design. He's an amazing artist. Tony, I believe, is also the guy behind the Spiderwick Chronicles, so he's just a fascinating creative individual. Huge fan of his art. And the fact that you even mentioned that it has this Dr. Seussian, I just made that up, Grinch-like design. I mean, it just shows you that his design of the Githyanki, his version artistically, stands out to me, especially because there's nothing else that looks like it. It's very distinctly him. Actually, one of the key Planescape game designers, Zeb Cook, showed me some books he had recently purchased from Japan on an artist named Yoshitaka Amano. I believe that is the artist behind the Final Fantasy series. Of course, the artwork totally blew me away. Back in '94, I don't think many knew of his work here in the States, but now his work, rightfully, is much more known thanks to the availability of his lavishly illustrated books. His costume design and patterning was certainly an influence on my Githyanki images. And then you see some sketches here. It's just beautiful seeing. Besides the whole Design 101, I have an art design background. I'm a huge concept art guy, dabbling in those fields for the last 25 years as well. So when I can see the behind the scenes of the aesthetic and sketch work of something, I'm fascinated. This morning, I played around with the original Fiend Folio cover pose while incorporating bits of the original and my Planescape design. In my attempt of maturing as an illustrator, I veered away from the look, I am evil, see my evil face, and created a more alien, otherworldly look. Besides, the actions of these villainous rogues certainly define their alignment. And I like that approach because they come from the astral plane. So, really cool look. P.S. Speaking of nonsense children's book authors, did you know that the Githyanki's main weapon, their Vorpal sword, was originally created by none other than... Let me start this over because this is important. P.S. Speaking of nonsense children's book authors, did you know that the Githyanki's main weapon, their Vorpal sword, was originally created by none other than Lewis Carroll for his poem Jabberwocky in Through the Looking Glass? That's so cool. And there you have it, folks. This is kind of pasted in through editing, and I'm recording this independent of the main video, but right here on the fly. I learned something, and hopefully you did as well. Very, very cool. Thanks for that blog post there, Tony. And the cool thing about that one is, in that one, you didn't only have the Githyanki. That was the first time we saw, or there was some information given as to their society. And also their, I think it's the Lich Queen Vlaakith, who's the Githyanki leader. Moving into 3rd edition, the Githyanki made an appearance in the Psionics Handbook first, I think, and they were in the official 3rd edition Monster Manual. The revision of 3rd edition saw 3.5 come about, and in 3.5 the Githyanki made an appearance in quite a few different published materials. They were in the official 3.5 Monster Manual, they were in the expanded Psionics Handbook, they were in Complete Psionic, and the Githyanki made an appearance. They kind of went back to their roots, their magazine roots. Remember, they were first created in White Dwarf Magazine number 12. They were in Dragon Magazine number 309 and Dungeon Magazine issue number 100. And within 100, there was the Githyanki themselves, their variants, some templates on them, and most importantly, some further details on their leader, the Lich Queen Vlaakith. Towards the end of 3.5, there was an optional monster book, which I think it was, they went all the way up to 3.5 had a ton of material. I remember there were just stacks of books. I think that was the same edition when you had all these different like kits for rogue and fighter and all this other stuff. And towards the end of 3.5, there was the Monster Manual 4, where the Githyanki once again made an appearance in there as well. Within that, you had 3 new variants, the Githyanki Captain, the Gish Githyanki, and I think it was the Githyanki Soldier. Now, with the release of 4th edition, there was a preview book called Worlds and Monsters, and the Githyanki were in there. They were brought into the official 4th edition Monster Manual, in which they also had some variants. They had the Gish, which was taken from the previous edition, and then there were 2 new variants. There was the Githyanki Warrior and the Githyanki Mind Splicer, something to that effect. Now, moving into the last edition, which is our current edition of 5th edition, the Githyanki were printed in the official Monster Manual, and the Githyanki in 5th edition also make a really big, they're featured quite well in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. And most importantly, it is the first time that we see some options and some information there for the Githyanki as a playable race. So there you see their journey from George R.R. Martin's race, the name Githyanki in 1977, Charles Stross creating them and putting them in the Fiend Factory from Games Workshop's White Dwarf Magazine issue number 12, all the way to their presence in the 5th edition Monster Manual and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. Beyond that, as far as where their journey goes, they go and travel within your mind and within your stories. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care.